fancy going around the world looking for rare and endangered animals and writing a book about it. So he said, well, that's fine. That's what I do all day anyway. So we set out to find. We went around the world looking for various animals. And there's one I particularly want to talk about, which is the Kakapo, which is in New Zealand. The Kakapo is a flightless parrot. It's forgotten how to fly. Sadly, it has also forgotten that it's forgotten how to fly. And people say that a seriously worried kakapo will occasionally run up a tree and jump out of it. Opinion divides as to what then happens. Some people will tell you that the kakapo has developed some kind of rudimentary parachuting ability. And other people will tell you that the kakapo flies kind of like a brick. But the thing is that you will never really see a seriously worried kakapo, because kakapos have not learnt to worry. Now, this seems a very strange thing to say. I mean, we don't think of worrying as being something you need to learn how to do. I mean, you know, living in the Western world as we do, and worrying is basically what we do all day. It's as natural as breathing. We worry and we worry and we worry about everything that happens. But it is actually an acquired piece of behavior. And it comes out of the fact that we have evolved, human beings have evolved in environments that contain predators. Partly we've been predators ourselves, but other things have predated on us. And that is a very, very good way to learn worrying. You tend to be on the lookout. You tend to be very ready to sort of run away or to fight or whatever it is. And but a number of animals haven't necessarily learned that, because New Zealand, as I said earlier, was not part of Gondwana land. It didn't take with it a representative sample of livestock, because it just came up from under the ocean, and therefore there were no animals on it. Well, maybe some dead fish, I don't know, but I mean there were no. In the end, it got populated by the only animals which could reach it, which of course were birds. Also, I suppose there were a couple of species of bat that were native to New Zealand as well, which are in fact mammals, but you get the point. You basically had to fly to get there. So New Zealand was almost entirely inhabited throughout the major part of its history by birds. Now, one of the things that happens when you have an environment which is kind of not completely full in terms of the niches that are being exploited is that animals gradually adapt to fill those other niches. Now, flying is a very, very specialized thing to do, and it has all sorts of advantages. If you want, it's partially, it is a flight mechanism, flight in the terms of wanting to run away from something, and it's a very expensive activity. You know, because flying takes a lot of energy, and energy you get by eating food, and the more food you eat, of course, the harder it is to fly. So you've got so there are sort of constant sort of problems: eat a bit, fly a bit; eat a bit, fly a bit. If one can, if I can be very naughty and anthropomorphize for a moment, it's almost as if some of the animals on some of the birds on New Zealand kind of said to each other, "Well, why we could, since nothing wants to eat us particularly." We could sort of settle in for a rather larger meal and go for a waddle afterwards. And so gradually over a period of time, a number of the birds on New Zealand lost the ability to fly and flowed into the open niche of ground living. And these included, obviously, the kiwi and the weka and the old night parrot, the kakapo, which is this big, fat, strange parrot. And what happened, of course, with the kakapo, having grown up in an environment with no predators, is that when man arrived on New Zealand with his deadly menagerie of dogs and cats and stoats and rats and so on, is that suddenly these animals were waddling for their lives, except they didn't know to do it. Now, it's very interesting what happens when you grow up in an environment without predators. There's another example of it, actually, in the Galapagos. And there's another bird that behaves in many ways in a similar way to the kakapo. And this is a bird called the blue-footed booby. And it's called the blue-footed booby really for two reasons. One has to do with the color of its feet. And the other has to do with a piece of behavior that I'm now going to describe to you, which is if you see, on the beach and somewhere in the Galapagos, if you see a blue-footed booby sitting on the beach or on a branch of a tree, you can walk up to it and you can pick it up. Because what the booby is thinking, and this is probably why we call it a booby, is that once you finish with it, you'll put it back. It doesn't know any different because it has evolved in an environment without predators. So this is exactly the problem that the kakapo has had. It doesn't know to run away. It doesn't know to be nervous. So when it encounters another animal, it just sort of sits there and waits for the other animal to make the next move, which is usually a pretty fast and fatal one. Make the next move, which is usually a pretty fast and fatal one. So what has happened to the kakapo since human beings arrived there is that its population has dropped from, we don't know what it was, maybe as many as 1 million, probably not quite as many as that, to the low 40s. It's a terrible, terrible, catastrophic drop. And so there's whole teams of people who are working very, very hard to try and conserve this animal. But they run into a problem, which is not only is the kakapo completely unable to defend itself, but it has another problem, which has to do with its reproductive techniques. Now, its reproductive techniques are incredibly long drawn out, very complicated, and almost totally ineffective. Now, some people tell you that the mating call of the male kakapo actively repels the female kakapo, which is a sort of behavior you're otherwise only really sort of find in discos. But let me tell you about the mating call of the kakapo. What it does in the sort of mating season, which is about 100 days of the year, is it finds itself a big rocky outcrop overlooking on sort of great sort of huge valleys of fjordland. And it finds itself this rocky outcrop overlooking the valley because acoustics are very important to what it's about to do. And it sort of digs itself out a kind of bowl that it sits in, and it puffs out these two enormous air sacs around its chest that form reverberation chambers. And it sits there in its bowl for 100 nights of the year, 8 hours a night, and for all that period, it sits there and performs over and over and over again the opening bars of Dark Side of the Moon. Now those of you, the grey-haired ones around here who can remember Dark Side of the Moon, will remember that it starts with this deep, sort of throbbing heartbeat. And this is the noise that the kakapo makes, this deep, throbbing, booming noise. And in fact, those people who have heard it will tell you that to begin with, you don't even hear it. You feel it more like a sort of wobble in the pit of your stomach, and gradually your ear tunes in, and you can just hear this sound. And this sound rolls through the valleys. And it's very, very deep bass sound. Now, there are two important characteristics of bass sound, one of which is that these great long wavelengths of bass sound travel great distances, and they fill the valleys because they've got a long way to reach. See if they can find a female kakapo. But if there is a female kakapo out there, which there probably isn't, and if she likes the sound of this booming, which it turns out she probably doesn't, and if she decides, okay, well, I'll go and look for the male kakapo, you then come up across a problem that comes from the other characteristic of bass sound, which is this. Are you familiar with those kind of stereo sets you can get where the speaker system consists of two tiny little treble speakers that you have to place very accurately in the room because they're going to define the stereo image? And then you have a thing called a sort of subwoofer or a boombox, which is a sort of great thing that you can put anywhere in the room you like. You can put it behind the sofa if you like, because the other characteristic of bass sound, and remember we're talking about the mating sound of the male kakapo, is that you can't tell where it's coming from. So supposing, while the male is making his mating call, supposing there's a female out there, which there probably isn't, and supposing he hears that she likes the booming, which she probably doesn't, she will then not be able to find the male kakapo. Now, assuming she manages to overcome this problem as well, then we can work up another problem, which is the female kakapo will only consent to mate when the podocarp tree is in fruit. Now, we've all had relationships a little like that. But if they've got through all those obstacles, the female kakapo finally sort of lays one egg every 2 or 3 years. And you think, so far from trying to sort of preserve this animal, how on earth has it made it this long? How on earth has it managed to survive this long? And the answer is a very interesting one. And it's also interesting that it should be such a puzzle to us. Now, before man set foot on New Zealand, and when he arrived there, man arriving, particularly the men arriving from Western Europe, it looks like the home counties. It's all sort of green and lush. And we don't see that the moment we set foot on it, it changes fundamentally, because before man set foot on New Zealand, there were no predators there, and the moment we set foot on it, there are predators there. So we never see an environment with no predators, where the rules work in a very, very different way. Now, any given species, any given animal's reproductive strategy is determined by a number of factors. Producing young is a very expensive activity. It takes a huge amount of bodily resources, it takes a huge amount of energy, it takes a huge amount of time. You're basically going to produce enough young so that your genes will continue to proliferate. If you come up with more young than you need to fulfill that thing, then you're running against the sort of grain of nature, which is to be extremely abstemious and to conserve energy. So the rate at which the kakapos used to reproduce, was exactly the right one for sustaining a stable population in an environment with no predators. If they had reproduced at a higher rate, then in fact there would have been too many of them. Now, I don't want to sort of head off into group selection territory for those of you who are students of evolution, but essentially it would have happened that if a population grows too fast, it hits at kind of rather too acute an angle the ability of the environment to sustain that population, whereupon your population drops off rather sharply. And in fact, you can, if the population oscillates too fast, then you can get to the point where, in fact, sort of chaos theory takes over, and the population just oscillates wildly and can hit zero at any moment just out of the sheer maths of it. And once you've hit zero, of course, it's not going to go up again. But the point is, their reproduction rate was exactly the right reproduction rate for an environment with no predators. And the fact that it's puzzling to us is because we've never known an environment with no predators, because any environment that has us in it is an environment that has predators. Whoa! Sorry, man. My life flashed before my eyes, including the notes of my speech. So, what can we learn or understand from the plight the kakapo finds itself in? Well, think of, let's be naughty again and anthropomorphize. Because what is happening is something like this, that it has a reproductive strategy that has served it very, very well, a lifestyle that has served it very, very well in the environment it grew up in. And even though that environment has suddenly changed, it doesn't have any means of adapting. It doesn't have any means of looking at itself in its context. It merely has its evolved instinct to go on. And its evolved instinct tells it that this is the right rate to reproduce. So it suddenly finds itself in crisis because its population is dropping. So it's almost as if the thing is thinking, well, here we are in crisis, let's do what we're really good at, which is to reproduce really slowly. And their population goes down even further. Say, oh dear, well, we better try really hard to reproduce really, really, really slowly. And of course, it's a completely futile strategy in the new environment. It's really, really, really slowly. And of course, it's a completely futile strategy in the new environment. Now, let's look at human beings following the same kind of logic. We have our own strategies. And our strategies, as I mentioned earlier, are that we tend to use the resources we find around ourselves. We tend to be very competitive. We tend to be very aggressive. That has created an enormously powerful culture that we all belong in and we all partake in. And we are all descendants of those who have put those strategies into the most effective use. That we take the stuff we need from the environment and we are tool makers. We are tool makers. And as tool makers, we have almost sort of buffered ourselves from the normal effect, from the normal abrasion of evolutionary forces. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Normally what happens with speciation, what drives a new species to develop, is when a particular family of animals may get split up because of population pressure or geological upheaval or whatever, and some small population finds itself off in a new environment. Let's suppose we're talking about an environment where perhaps it's a lot colder. And you'll find, after a surprisingly small number of generations, you revisit that population and you'll find that those animals which have genes which favor a thicker coat will have differentially prospered, and the whole population will have a much thicker coat. Now, human beings, we are able to move into any environment we like. We can live in the tundra, we can live in the Gobi Desert, we can even manage to sort of live in New York, for heaven's sake. Because when we arrive, or when early man arrived in say, a very cold environment, instead of having to sort of wait for generations while thicker coat genes predominated, we see an animal that's already got a thicker coat, we say, we'll have it off him. So we have always learned to take from our environment, to manipulate it to our own purposes, to be competitive and to be aggressive, and that has been a fantastically successful strategy up till now. Because up till now, we have been living in what seemed to be limitless resources. Suddenly, that ain't so anymore. Suddenly, the effect of what we do in the world is beginning to be very, very noticeable. And we are clearly beginning to degrade the environment in which we live. Now, look at the Kakapo, which has its own strategies, which were appropriate for an earlier environment, and it cannot think of anything else to do because it isn't a great thinker. And for it to change its reproduction strategy is something it can't do. It will be against Kakapo nature. It will be an in-Kakapo thing to do. For human beings, we are reacting the same way, despite the fact that we do have this additional faculty that the Kakapos don't have, which is we have the ability, as scientists, as people who are self-aware, as animals that have learnt to examine their own behavior and to think about it in more objective terms, we can see that our instinct drives us to do one thing, but our intelligence reveals to us the problems that will occur if we continue to follow those instincts unabated. And the question is, can we actually learn to listen to our intelligence rather than our instincts? Now, we've had a long time of science revealing to us one point after another that our instincts are wrong. I mean, our instincts tell us the world is flat. Our instincts tell us the world is at the center of the universe and the sun is a little sort of ball of light that goes around it. Our instincts tell us all kinds of stuff that is just plainly wrong. And it's only our intelligence and our ability to educate ourselves that can counteract the instincts that we developed through many generations of living in a different environment than the one we now find ourselves in. So the only hope for our continued prosperity is to learn to apply the results of our intelligence through education and through scientific education to our current thinking, and learn to use our current thinking, to learn to use our ability to think objectively to overcome the biases of our instincts. Thank you very much.